David prayed for God to provide, but every night he secretly opened a betting app and trusted the next win more than the prayer he had just prayed. He was a Christian father who loved his family, worked hard, and wanted to rebuild the family savings. But online gambling offered him something faith never promised: fast money without waiting. What began as a small attempt to pay a bill was quietly becoming a sports betting addiction that threatened far more than his bank account. Here's the uncomfortable truth: a person can speak about trusting God while secretly depending on something else for security. David believed he was gambling to protect his family, until one discovery revealed that his choices were teaching his own son to follow the same path. But when everything finally came into the light, David had to choose between chasing one more bet and rediscovering biblical contentment, and the decision he made would determine whether his family could ever trust him again. David Mercer had always believed that a good man should keep his family safe, his bills paid, and his worries hidden. At 49, the Christian father worked hard, prayed faithfully, and still watched the numbers in his bank account shrink each month. The car needed repairs, the electric bill had increased, and groceries seemed to cost more every time Laura returned from the store. He smiled at dinner and asked the children about their day, but inside, shame whispered that everyone would be better off with a stronger provider. That quiet accusation followed him everywhere, even into the moments when he knelt beside the bed and asked God for provision. David wasn't lazy, careless, or unwilling to sacrifice. In fact, he often carried more responsibility than anyone around him realized. He skipped lunches, delayed buying new shoes, and worked extra hours whenever his manager offered them. Yet the family savings kept disappearing. There is a dangerous kind of pressure that grows when a man connects his entire worth to how much money he can produce. Instead of seeing financial hardship as a season to face with honesty, David began treating it like evidence that he had personally failed. And once shame becomes a private judge, even small setbacks can start sounding like a final sentence. Laura tried to reassure him, saying they could review the budget together, cut unnecessary expenses, and speak with someone at church. Practical steps like listing debts, separating needs from wants, and asking for financial guidance can bring light into a confusing season. But David heard her suggestions as confirmation that she had noticed his weakness, even though she was offering partnership, not criticism. Biblical contentment teaches a person to value faithfulness over appearances. But David was becoming more concerned with looking successful than living truthfully. He wanted to fix everything alone, because pride often wears a work shirt and calls itself responsibility. Late at night, David sat in the living room, scrolling through sports news while the rest of the house slept. Advertisements for online gambling appeared between game highlights, promising easy bonuses, fast winnings, and a chance to turn knowledge into income. At first, he ignored them, telling himself that sports betting addiction only happened to reckless people who didn't know when to stop. Still, one message caught his attention. A small bet could become enough money to cover an overdue bill before anyone knew there was a problem, and for a man desperate to feel like a provider again. That promise began to look less like temptation and more like an opportunity. The next evening, David saw the same advertisement again, only this time it offered a welcome bonus and risk-free first bet. He told himself there was no harm in looking, because looking wasn't the same as gambling. At least, that was how he framed it. Within minutes, the Christian father had downloaded the online gambling app and created an account with trembling curiosity. He deposited a small amount, less than the cost of a family dinner, and called it entertainment rather than a financial decision. That is how temptation often enters, not through a dramatic doorway, but through a sentence that sounds reasonable enough to repeat. David knew sports well, or at least he believed he did after years of watching games, studying teams, and debating statistics with friends. The app made every choice feel intelligent. as if sports betting addiction belonged only to people who bet blindly and lost control. He selected a match, studied the odds, and convinced himself that his knowledge gave him an advantage over the average user. Of course, an app designed to make money rarely introduces itself by saying, "Hello, I'd like to slowly take yours." Instead, it congratulated him, flashed bright numbers, and made a small wager feel like a clever financial strategy. When David won his first bet, the amount was modest, but the emotional reward was much larger than the money itself. For a few minutes, he felt capable again, as though he had discovered a hidden door leading back to financial stability. He imagined paying the electric bill early, rebuilding the family savings, and surprising Laura with relief instead of another difficult conversation. Biblical contentment had once taught him to trust God through slow, faithful provision, but the app offered speed without patience. And speed can feel like an answer to prayer when someone is too discouraged to examine where the answer is coming from. David placed another small bet the following day, promising himself that he would stop as soon as he earned enough to cover one bill. He didn't mention the app to Laura because, in his mind, there was nothing to explain until the plan actually worked. That secrecy should have warned him, since healthy decisions rarely need darkness in order to survive honest questions. Still, the Christian father felt strangely hopeful each time he opened the online gambling app and watched the numbers change. Then a second win arrived, larger than the first, and David began wondering what might happen if he risked just a little more. After 2 early wins, David no longer opened the app with caution. He opened it with expectation. The Christian father began believing he had discovered a pattern other people were too careless to notice. He increased the amounts slowly, telling himself that larger bets were necessary if he truly wanted to rebuild the family savings. Whenever he lost, he didn't see it as a warning. He saw it as a temporary setback that one smart wager could erase. "One more bet, and I can fix this," became the sentence he repeated whenever wisdom tried to interrupt him. Soon, online gambling was no longer a small distraction during a game. It was following him through the entire day. He checked scores at breakfast, studied odds during work breaks, and carried his phone into rooms where no one could see the screen. Sports betting addiction often grows quietly, replacing peace with constant calculation and turning ordinary moments into chances to recover money. David started deleting notifications and lowering the brightness whenever Laura walked past, as though darkness could make the decision harmless. The secrecy gave him a temporary sense of control, but it was actually proof that control was already slipping away. He moved money between accounts, postponed smaller bills, and used funds he had once promised would remain untouched. Each transfer seemed easy to justify because he still believed the next win would restore everything before anyone noticed. Biblical contentment asks a person to live truthfully with what God has placed in their hands. But David was chasing what he wished he had. He wasn't spending the money on luxury, which made his excuses feel almost noble. He told himself he was gambling for the family, but a wrong road doesn't become right simply because someone claims to be walking it for people they love. At dinner, David laughed at the right moments, nodded during conversations, and kept his phone face down beside his plate. Laura noticed he seemed distracted, yet he blamed deadlines, poor sleep, and the usual pressure of trying to be a responsible Christian father. Meanwhile, the family savings were shrinking, and every loss increased both his fear and his determination to win them back. He promised himself he would confess after one successful night, because confession always seemed easier in the future than honesty in the present. Then, one afternoon, he left his phone unlocked on the table just as Sophie reached for it to take a picture. Sophie picked up David's phone to take a picture of the family dog wearing Ethan's old baseball cap. Before she opened the camera, a notification appeared across the screen. Bet lost. Balance updated. The 12-year-old stared at the words, confused. because she had heard her parents talk about money being tight. She knew what online gambling was from advertisements, but she never imagined her Christian father would be using it. When David noticed the phone in her hands, the fear inside him reacted before his wisdom had time to speak. "What are you doing with my phone?" he snapped, crossing the room faster than Sophie had ever seen him move. She tried to explain that she only wanted a picture, but David grabbed the device and accused her of invading his privacy. His voice was sharper than the situation deserved, and the girl's expression changed from curiosity to fear. Sports betting addiction often makes a person protect the habit more aggressively than the relationships being damaged by it. In a single moment, David defended a secret screen more fiercely than the trust in his daughter's eyes. Sophie quietly asked what the notification meant and whether he had lost money from the family savings. David told her it was only a small game and insisted that adults sometimes made financial choices children couldn't understand. That explanation sounded respectable, but it was really a wall built from embarrassment, pride, and half-truths. Biblical contentment invites honesty, even when the truth is uncomfortable, while hidden sin usually demands complicated explanations. David could have paused, apologized, and asked Laura for help, but shame convinced him that denial was still safer than confession. Sophie left the room without arguing, yet her silence troubled David more than a loud confrontation would have. A few minutes later, he found the dog still wearing the crooked cap, which should have made him laugh, but it didn't. He remembered how quickly Sophie had flinched when he raised his voice, and realized she had seen a side of him he couldn't easily explain. Still, instead of facing the online gambling problem, he opened the app to check whether another bet could recover the latest loss. And while David focused on fixing the number on the screen, Sophie began wondering whether she should tell her mother what she had seen. Laura noticed the problem on a Thursday morning while reviewing the account before paying Ethan's school expenses. The balance was lower than it should have been, and several transfers had been made at hours when the family was usually asleep. At first, she assumed it was a banking error, because the truth felt too painful to consider without proof. Then Sophie quietly mentioned the strange notification she had seen on David's phone, and the way he had reacted. In that moment, Laura realized the missing money and David's growing secrecy were connected. She searched through the statements and found repeated payments linked to online gambling, some small and others frighteningly large. Part of the family's savings was gone, including money they had set aside for Ethan's future education and emergencies. Laura sat at the kitchen table staring at the screen, not only grieving the money, but the trust that had disappeared with it. A sports betting addiction rarely damages numbers alone. It changes conversations, routines, promises, and the emotional safety of a home. By the time David walked through the door, Laura had printed every transaction and placed the pages beside his untouched dinner. David's face changed the moment he saw the statements. Yet his first response wasn't confession, it was explanation. He said he had only used the money temporarily and that he was trying to win back what he had already lost. The Christian father insisted that one strong result could restore the account before Ethan ever needed the funds. This is one of the most dangerous lies in online gambling. The belief that the same behavior causing the damage will somehow become the rescue. Laura listened, but each justification revealed that David was still defending the hope that had been destroying them. She asked him whether he had prayed before taking the money, and David suddenly had no clever answer left. Biblical contentment had once taught him that provision came through honesty, patience, work, and trust in God's timing. Now he was treating chance like a provider, secrecy like a strategy, and desperation like wisdom. Laura told him that the lost money mattered, but what frightened her most was how easily he had learned to lie while calling it sacrifice. Before David could respond, Ethan appeared in the hallway and said there was something else the family needed to know. David didn't answer Ethan immediately, because the question had reached the place where excuses could no longer protect him. He looked at Laura, Sophie, and Ethan, then admitted that his online gambling had become more than a bad financial decision. The Christian father had trusted the next bet to rescue him, while treating prayer as something he could use after his own plans failed. He confessed that sports betting addiction had turned fear into a master, secrecy into a habit, and money into a false promise of peace. For the first time in months, David stopped saying he could fix everything and admitted that he needed help. He deleted the betting app in front of his family, but he understood that removing an icon wouldn't instantly remove the desire to gamble. Real repentance requires more than an emotional promise. It includes confession, changed access, accountability, and practical boundaries. David contacted the bank, blocked gambling transactions, gave Laura full access to the accounts, and asked a trusted church elder to meet with him weekly. They created a realistic plan to rebuild the family savings slowly, beginning with essential bills, a small emergency fund, and honest monthly reviews. The process wasn't dramatic or glamorous, but restoration rarely arrives like fireworks. It usually walks through the front door wearing work boots. David also sat beside Ethan and apologized without blaming stress, advertisements, or financial pressure for the choices he had made. Together, they closed Ethan's account, discussed the manipulation behind online gambling, and agreed to speak openly whenever the urge returned. David explained that a father's spiritual leadership isn't proven by never failing, but by humbly returning to truth when failure is exposed. Biblical contentment began taking on a new meaning for them. Gratitude without pretending, patience without passivity, and trust without chasing shortcuts. They started reading Matthew 6 together, especially Jesus' words about worry, treasure, and seeking God's kingdom before everything else. The weeks that followed weren't easy, and David sometimes felt the old thought return. One more bet and I can fix this. But now he answered it with truth, called his accountability partner, stepped away from sports apps, and spoke honestly with Laura. The Christian father was learning that freedom from sports betting addiction wasn't built through willpower alone, but through surrender repeated each day. Little by little, the family savings began to recover, but something more valuable was also being restored: the family's trust in David's words. And as he prayed with them one evening, David realized the question was no longer whether God would provide, but whether he would finally trust God's way. David's story reveals a truth many people avoid. Not every false god looks like an idol. Sometimes it looks like a glowing screen, a promised payout, or the thought, one more bet and I can fix this. Sports betting addiction doesn't only threaten money, it can steal honesty, peace, spiritual authority, and the trust built inside a home. Biblical contentment doesn't mean ignoring financial problems. It means facing them with truth, wise planning, patience, hard work, prayer, and the humility to ask for help instead of trusting online gambling to become a provider. So, what have you been trusting to give you the security only God can provide? Is there a habit you've been hiding because you still believe you can control it? And what are your children, spouse, or loved ones learning from the choices you make when life becomes difficult? Don't wait until the family's savings are gone or someone begins copying your behavior. Bring the secret into the light. Remove access to temptation, seek accountability, and return to Jesus, one honest step at a time. If this story about a Christian father spoke to your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications for more stories that strengthen faith, wisdom, and real transformation.